It is November 24th, 1944, just past twilight, when the first rumble begins. Faint at first, like distant thunder rolling over the Pacific. Miles above the Blackwater, beyond the reach of patrol boats and coast watchers, an American formation moves through the darkness with mechanical patience. B-29 Superfortresses, for engines each, silver bodies catching only the briefest moonlight, glide like phantoms toward the Japanese home islands. Inside the lead bomber, frost clings to window frames. Oxygen masks hiss quietly. Crews speak little. Their voices are muffled, brittle from the thin air at 30,000 feet. They know the risk. They also know something even more unbelievable. No Japanese fighters have come. No spotlights. Not even a radar warning. Tokyo sleeps below, unaware of the steel wings crossing the ocean sky. Hours deep into Japanese territory, unchallenged. In coastal command centers, officers pace with maps and cigarettes, unaware that American bombers have already passed the point they believed impossible to cross. A new reality drifts ever closer, carried on engines Japan cannot intercept. And with those engines comes fire. By late 1944, Japan still believed its home islands were untouchable. The Pacific Ocean, vast and forbidding, had been their shield for years. Early victories had reinforced this perception. From Pearl Harbor in December 1941 to the rapid conquest of the Philippines, Malaya, and Singapore, the Japanese military had proven that their empire could strike far and, more importantly, defend itself from strikes in return. Coastal radar networks, fighter airfields, and layered island fortresses gave Japanese officers a sense of invincibility, a belief that no enemy could reach Tokyo without being detected, intercepted, or destroyed. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States had begun a transformation that Japan had barely acknowledged. American industry, unrelenting and massive, churned out ships, tanks, and aircraft at a scale unmatched in history. In 1942, while Japanese engineers debated how to improve the Zero fighter, American factories were already designing planes that could fly farther, faster, and higher than any Japanese aircraft could hope to match. Among them, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress became the crown jewel, a four-engine bomber with unprecedented range and payload capacity, pressurized cabins, and remote-controlled defensive guns. It was a machine built not just for war, but to break the very assumptions of enemy defense. The United States' first attempts to reach Japan were cautious and fraught with logistical challenges. Operation Matterhorn, the plan to bomb the Japanese mainland from bases in China, was hampered by supply lines stretching over the hump, the treacherous Himalayan air route. Every mission required dozens of transport flights to carry fuel and bombs over mountains, leaving B-29 crews exhausted and the strategic impact minimal. Japanese officers initially dismissed these raids as a nuisance, inconvenient, but not existential. Japan's defensive perimeter, meanwhile, extended across the Pacific Islands. Truk, the Marianas, the Carolines, each fortified with radar and fighters. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Services assumed this network would detect any approaching threat. Radar stations in the Mariana Chain and along the Philippine Sea were operational, but plagued by personnel shortages and equipment limitations. Night interception, in particular, remained a weakness. The Japanese had few aircraft capable of high-altitude, night operations, and even fewer pilots trained for them. Mistakes in coordination between Army and Navy units further weakened response times. Yet Japan was not idle. In early 1944, intelligence reports began hinting at a new American bomber, faster, higher flying, and far larger than anything Japan had previously faced. Officers convened to discuss the threat, but confidence ran high. The Pacific was wide. Tokyo was distant. No aircraft could realistically bridge the gap without being detected, they reasoned. The geography of their empire was their ultimate shield. By mid-1944, American strategy shifted. With the capture of the Marianas campaign, U.S. forces secured airfields that could host B-29s within striking distance of the Japanese mainland. Saipan, Tinian and Guam were transformed almost overnight. Runways extending 3 kilometers, fuel storage, maintenance hangars, and barracks built with military precision. For Japan, the islands were still hundreds of miles away. Dangerous, perhaps, but still theoretically defendable. Radar coverage existed, but the overwhelming scale of U.S. logistics and the novelty of the B-29 presented a problem Japanese officers had yet to grasp. The bomber's operational ceiling exceeded that of most Japanese fighters, and its speed challenged the reaction time of any intercept force. Meanwhile, the human dimension of the air campaign was becoming clear. B-29 crews faced flights lasting over 14 hours, crossing vast stretches of ocean with nothing beneath but black water. Supply shortages, mechanical failures, and the ever-present threat of anti-aircraft fire made every mission perilous. For Japanese commanders, these flights were anomalies, strange successes that seemed improbable. The Imperial General Headquarters received reports of bombings on the Chinese coast and the Philippines, but the threat to the home islands remained abstract. Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagoya, these cities seemed out of reach. And yet the stage was set. The gap in Japanese defensive strategy, the technological leap represented by the B-29, and the American industrial momentum combined into a quiet inevitability. When the first full-scale penetration of Japanese airspace occurred, it would shock officers at every level. A moment when years of assumptions about invulnerability would be shattered in hours. Natural transition to next section. The capture of the Marianas would make the theoretical threat real. What had been distant, abstract, and improbable was now a tangible reality on Japan's doorstep. By the summer of 1944, the Mariana Islands campaign had reached its climax. Saipan fell in July, followed by Tinian and Guam, opening a direct path for the United States to project air power against Japan. These islands were not just strategic outposts. They were launching pads for a new kind of war. Runways were carved from coral, massive enough to accommodate the B-29 Superfortress, whose wingspan of nearly 43 meters required space and precision. Entire logistical systems were constructed almost overnight. Fuel storage depots, maintenance hangars, ammunition dumps, and barracks to house thousands of crewmen. What had once seemed impossible, flying a heavy bomber directly to the Japanese mainland, was now within reach. The B-29 itself represented a technological leap that stunned Japanese officers when finally observed in operational form. Four Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines gave it the speed to outrun most interceptors. Its service ceiling exceeded 30,000 feet, beyond the altitude of most Japanese fighters. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to operate in comfort at extreme altitudes. Remote-controlled, computer-assisted gun turrets replaced traditional gun positions, and the aircraft could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs, a payload unmatched in the Pacific theater. Japan had no equivalent, and their attempts to develop long-range interceptors lagged behind by years. Despite intelligence reports and sightings of B-29s in China, the Imperial General Headquarters underestimated the threat. Radar coverage along the Pacific perimeter was incomplete, and many Japanese officers dismissed the possibility that these bombers could fly from the Marianas without detection. Fighter squadrons were stretched thin, pilots were fatigued from years of attrition, and night fighting capability remained rudimentary. The assumption persisted. Japan's home islands were beyond the practical reach of enemy air power. The strategic concept was equally revolutionary. The XXI Bomber Command, under General Curtis LeMay, was charged with bringing the fight to the Japanese mainland. Unlike previous efforts from China, the Marianas offered a secure staging area, reducing the complexity of supply lines and allowing for sustained bombing campaigns. For the first time, a combination of range, payload, and operational reliability created the conditions for an attack that could penetrate deep into Japanese territory with minimal risk of interception. Japanese commanders, still confident in their defensive perimeter, were slow to adjust. Even as American reconnaissance flights revealed airfield construction and B-29 deployments, skepticism remained. The Imperial Army and Navy debated defensive strategy, focusing on fighter placement and coastal observation posts. They failed to anticipate that a well-coordinated raid from Tinian or Saipan could exploit radar gaps, altitude advantages, and limited night fighting skills. This miscalculation would soon become painfully obvious. Meanwhile, the human element on both sides was sharpening. B-29 crews prepared meticulously for missions of unprecedented length, often more than 3,000 kilometers over open ocean. Navigation, fuel management, and timing became a matter of survival. Japanese radar operators and fighter pilots remained largely untested against such long-range, high-altitude aircraft. The cognitive dissonance of the Imperial General Headquarters was compounded by the novelty of the threat. They could not believe an enemy bomber could simply cross thousands of kilometers of ocean, strike Tokyo, and return without interception. By the autumn of 1944, all conditions converged. The Marianas were secure, B-29s were operational, and Japanese defensive assumptions were outdated. The stage was set for a shock that would reverberate through the Imperial General Headquarters, radar stations, and military academies. The realization that the Pacific was no longer an impenetrable barrier, and that the enemy could strike at the heart of Japan with devastating effect. When the first mission departed Tinian, crossing the ocean without challenge, Japanese officers would face a truth they had long denied, one that would change the course of the war and the very concept of homeland defense. Natural transition to angles. With the Pacific barrier shattered, the story now unfolds across multiple perspectives: technological, tactical, human, and psychological, each revealing how this unprecedented penetration reshaped both sides of the conflict. Angle A. Technological shock. The B-29 Superfortress was not just another bomber. It was a machine years ahead of its time. From the perspective of Japanese officers, encountering it for the first time was a revelation. Its pressurized cabins allowed crew members to operate at altitudes that rendered most Japanese fighters ineffective. The R-3350 engines, though prone to overheating early on, provided enough power to sustain high-altitude flight over thousands of kilometers of open ocean. Its remote-controlled gun turrets meant that defensive fire could be coordinated across multiple angles, covering blind spots that would have been fatal in older bombers. Japanese engineers had long relied on lighter, faster aircraft, optimized for dogfighting rather than strategic bombing. The B-29's range of over 3,200 kilometers, combined with a payload of 20,000 pounds of bombs, created a threat that could not be met with existing fighter aircraft. Radar detection alone was insufficient. Even when radar picked up the formation, Japanese interceptors could rarely reach them before the bombs were dropped. The aircraft's very existence forced a reconsideration of the balance between offense and defense in the Pacific, a technological leap Japan could not match in time. Angle B. Human perspective. For the American crews, every mission was a mixture of precision and peril. Flying at 30,000 feet, in temperatures that could plunge below -40 degrees Celsius, crews relied on oxygen masks, heated suits, and nerves of steel. The Pacific stretched endlessly below, dark and unforgiving. A single engine failure, navigational error, or miscalculation could mean hours of drift over water with no chance of rescue. Despite the danger, there was also exhilaration. To be the first humans to cross the ocean in formation at such altitudes, unchallenged, carried a sense of invincibility. The meticulous planning, combined with the engineering marvel of the B-29, created a psychological advantage. Crews developed routines, precise timing, synchronized bombing runs, constant monitoring of fuel and engine performance. Every return flight reinforced the belief that this aircraft could dominate a theater where Japan had previously held control. Japanese civilians and radar operators had no such luxury. Reports of approaching bombers were often dismissed at first. When confirmation arrived, panic and confusion followed. For soldiers on the ground, The realization that these aircraft could arrive unchallenged induced a mixture of fear and disbelief. The psychological shock of encountering a threat that seemingly defied all defensive logic. Angle C. Japanese command reaction. The Imperial Japanese General Headquarters struggled to comprehend the new reality. Radar plots showed formations crossing the Pacific with astonishing speed and altitude, yet fighter units were often too distant, too poorly equipped, or simply unprepared to respond effectively. Officers convened emergency meetings, poring over incomplete intelligence. Many refused to believe the reports at first. High-ranking officers debated the validity of radar detections. Could a single bomber really traverse the Pacific without interception? Was it a trick, a decoy, a mistake in reporting? These doubts delayed effective countermeasures. Even when the threat was acknowledged, structural weaknesses, disjointed command between the Navy and Army, shortages of fuel and trained pilots, and limited night fighting capability made a rapid response impossible. The shock was compounded by cultural assumptions. Japanese officers had long viewed their homeland as naturally protected by the vast ocean, reinforced by a string of fortified islands. The appearance of American bombers deep over their territory contradicted decades of defensive doctrine. The psychological and operational disbelief would ripple through all levels of command, from coastal radar stations to the Emperor's advisors, laying the groundwork for panic when the first full-scale bombing raid struck. Natural transition to next section. The story of the B-29's Pacific crossing is not complete without exploring the tactical and psychological dimensions of the raid, how Japan's strategic miscalculations, technological lag, and human responses intertwined to allow one of the most shocking penetrations of the war. Angle D. Tactical and strategic reality. From a tactical standpoint, Japan's defenses were ill-prepared for the B-29 threat. Coastal radar networks, while functional, were incomplete and often poorly coordinated. Detection could occur, but response times were inadequate for the long-range, high-speed bombers. Japanese fighter units faced multiple constraints: fuel shortages, insufficient aircraft capable of reaching operational altitudes, and inexperienced pilots who had never faced high-flying bombers over open ocean. Even when fighters scrambled, interception was rarely successful. The B-29 could cruise at altitudes of 30,000 to 33,000 feet, far above the effective ceiling of most Japanese Zeros and Ki-61s. Anti-aircraft artillery was similarly ineffective. Guns lacked the range or explosive power to threaten these bombers reliably. The U.S. exploited these limitations through carefully planned flight paths, timing attacks under cover of darkness, and using formations to concentrate defensive fire. Strategically, the capture of the Marianas Islands shifted the balance irrevocably. The Pacific was no longer a vast barrier, but a bridge for sustained air operations. The United States could now maintain a near-constant threat over the Japanese mainland, with bases within 1,500 kilometers of Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. This reach rendered traditional Japanese doctrine obsolete. Defensive perimeter theory, relying on early warning from distant islands, collapsed under the weight of American industrial and logistical coordination. Japanese officers faced the stark reality that their homeland was no longer secure, and every calculated response had to be reconsidered. Angle E. Psychological impact. For Japan's leadership and civilian population, the B-29 raids introduced an entirely new form of terror. Reports of high-altitude, unchallenged bombers created disbelief, quickly replaced by fear. Soldiers, civil defense personnel, and radar operators found themselves questioning decades of defensive assumptions. How could the enemy penetrate without being stopped? How vulnerable was the mainland, really? The psychological dimension extended to the air crews themselves. American pilots and bombardiers, flying hours over hostile territory, understood that survival depended not only on skill, but also on exploiting fear and confusion. They witnessed the unpreparedness of Japanese defenses firsthand. Uncoordinated radar reports, delayed fighter response, and isolated anti-aircraft fire. The sheer ability to strike unopposed gave them a sense of control rarely experienced in the Pacific theater. Civilians, hearing the distant drone of B-29 engines, felt panic at a scale previously unimaginable. For many, it was the first time war had touched the sky above their homes. Emergency response protocols were overwhelmed. Air raid alarms became a constant, nagging reminder that the Pacific Ocean, once a protective barrier, had failed. The psychological toll rippled through cities, factories, and military command alike, reshaping Japanese perception of the war. Natural transition to climax/turning point. Technological superiority, tactical brilliance, and psychological shock converged in the skies above Japan. All of these angles set the stage for the moment when theory became reality, when the B-29s crossed the Pacific unchallenged and delivered a devastating blow that would change the course of the war. The first full-scale penetration of Japanese airspace occurred on November 24, 1944. From Tinian, a formation of 111 B-29 Superfortresses lifted into the gray pre-dawn sky. Engines thrummed in synchronized rhythm, each aircraft carrying fuel for more than 3,200 kilometers and enough ordnance to strike a city-sized target. The crews knew the stakes. Failure meant death over the endless Pacific. Success, however, promised to redefine air warfare forever. As the bombers crossed the ocean, Japanese radar stations along the Marianas Philippine corridor struggled to make sense of the readings. At Imperial General Headquarters, officers studied plots that suggested a massive formation, yet no response was launched. Conflicting reports and disbelief paralyzed decision-making. Fighters scrambled too late, too far, and many could not reach the required altitudes. Anti-aircraft batteries, oriented for medium-range threats, simply could not touch the bombers. By mid-morning, the B-29s approached the Tokyo area. The city was largely unprepared for high-altitude bombing. Spotlights and searchlights, designed for night defense, were ineffective. As the bomb bay doors opened over the Musashino aircraft plant, bombs fell in precise patterns. Explosions tore through factory buildings, igniting fires that blackened the sky. Japanese officers could only watch as reports confirmed the impossible. The homeland had been struck without meaningful interception. The shock within the Japanese command was profound. Intelligence officers had predicted American bombing from China, but the reality of sustained operations from the Marianas was beyond imagination. Plans and assumptions, the belief in the protective shield of the Pacific, the idea that Japan could remain insulated, collapsed within hours. Messages flew between Army and Navy headquarters, frantic and contradictory. Some officers still hoped the reports were exaggerated. Others recognized the harsh truth. The B-29 had exposed a fatal vulnerability in Japan's defenses. The human dimension was equally striking. On the ground, workers, engineers, and civilians witnessed the consequences firsthand. Firefighters rushed to contain infernos, but the scale was overwhelming. The bombs were not random. They were precise, targeting industrial capacity. Each successful strike reinforced a lesson that Japanese military doctrine had never prepared them for. Strategic bombing from across the ocean could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, American crews experienced a mix of relief and awe. Hours of navigation, engine management, and high-altitude endurance culminated in this singular moment. The B-29s had crossed the Pacific, struck a major industrial target, and returned, largely unscathed. For General Curtis LeMay, it was confirmation that the new strategy was not only feasible but transformative. Air power had finally reached a scale and sophistication capable of bypassing geographic advantage, challenging even the most fortified assumptions of an enemy. This raid marked the opening of a new phase in the Pacific War. Japan's defensive doctrine, rooted in decades of successful expansion and control, had failed against a combination of technological innovation, meticulous planning, and audacious execution. Officers who had once dismissed the American threat now faced the reality. Their homeland was vulnerable, their cities exposed, and their air defenses obsolete. Natural transition to Climax Part 2. The November raid was only the beginning. The success of the first B-29 missions would lead to more audacious strikes, including the firebombing of Tokyo, and ultimately reshape the very nature of aerial warfare over Japan. The initial raid from Tinian was a warning. Within months, the scale and intensity of B-29 operations escalated dramatically. General Curtis LeMay, now commanding the XXI Bomber Command, recognized the limitations of high-altitude precision bombing over Japan's often cloudy skies. In early 1945, he made a radical decision: shift to low-altitude, nighttime incendiary raids. The intent was clear: exploit Japan's wooden urban architecture, overwhelm air defenses, and break both industrial capacity and civilian morale. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, the culmination of this strategy unfolded over Tokyo. More than 300 B-29s approached the city under cover of darkness. Japanese radar stations detected faint signatures, but scrambled fighters were too few, too low on fuel, and too ill-equipped for night interception. Anti-aircraft fire, sporadic and largely ineffective, added little resistance. From the air, the bombers appeared unstoppable, a relentless wave crossing the sky, unchallenged, precise, devastating. Bombs carrying incendiary payloads struck with calculated intensity. Entire districts of Tokyo, primarily residential and industrial, erupted in firestorms. Wooden buildings ignited almost instantly, and winds fanned flames across neighborhoods. Smoke rose in towering columns, visible even from aircraft thousands of feet above. Civilian casualties soared. Estimates suggest over 100,000 deaths in a single night. Japanese officers, witnessing reports from the ground, were paralyzed by disbelief and horror. Cities once considered safe from the reach of American bombers were now engulfed in fire. The psychological impact on the Imperial General Headquarters was profound. Senior officers, already shaken by previous raids, realized that their strategies, early warning networks, fighter placements, and coastal defenses were inadequate against a combination of technological superiority, strategic innovation, and relentless execution. The B-29s had effectively nullified Japan's geographic advantage, exposing the home islands to continuous, devastating strikes. LeMay's strategy was methodical. He rotated bombers through multiple bases, including Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, ensuring a sustained presence over Japan. The American industrial machine supplied a constant stream of aircraft, crews, and ordnance. For Japan, each raid reinforced a painful truth. The Pacific was no longer a natural barrier, and no amount of internal coordination could fully counter the threat. By summer 1945, the consequences were unavoidable. B-29s roamed Japanese skies with near impunity, striking Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and countless smaller cities. Factories, rail yards, and communication hubs were destroyed. Firestorms leveled entire districts. The human toll was staggering, and the military infrastructure Japan had relied upon for defense and production was crumbling. The combination of technological edge, audacious planning, and relentless execution had delivered a decisive blow. The first unchallenged crossing of the Pacific by B-29s was no longer an anomaly. It was a template for the final phase of the war. Japanese officers, previously confident in their homeland safety, now faced a terrifying reality. The United States could strike anywhere, anytime, without effective opposition. This turning point set the stage for the most consequential events of the Pacific War: the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the final collapse of Japan's industrial heart, and a surrender that would end a global conflict. Natural transition to aftermath. With cities burning, defenses overwhelmed, and morale fractured, Japan confronted the full consequences of the B-29 campaign. The aftermath would not only measure destruction in tons of bombs, but also in shattered strategy, civilian suffering, and the irreversible shift in the nature of modern warfare. The devastation wrought by the B-29 raids became immediately apparent across Japan. Cities that had once been thought safe behind the protective barrier of the Pacific were now exposed. The Imperial General Headquarters struggled to comprehend the scale of destruction. Early assessments from a November 1944 raids over Tokyo and Musashino revealed a troubling pattern. Critical industrial facilities could be struck at will, while Japanese defenses remained ineffective. Fighter squadrons, hampered by shortages of fuel, trained pilots, and suitable aircraft, were unable to mount sustained interception campaigns. Coastal radar provided early warning, but the speed and altitude of the B-29 formations rendered the data almost meaningless. Industrial disruption was immediate and severe. Musashino, one of Japan's primary aircraft production centers, had been heavily damaged. Rail lines connecting factories to ports were bombed, crippling the movement of raw materials. The Japanese war machine, already stressed by the loss of territories in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, faced a new existential threat. The enemy could now strike the heart of the homeland with impunity. Factories were flattened, assembly lines destroyed, and the workforce itself became a target as urban firestorms engulfed residential districts surrounding industrial zones. Civil defense systems were overwhelmed. Air raid alarms became a constant presence, yet they offered little protection. Fire brigades, equipped to handle localized incidents, were powerless against fires that consumed entire neighborhoods. Thousands of civilians were killed or injured, and millions were displaced. The psychological impact on the population was immense. The once abstract threat of American air power had become terrifyingly real. Fear and uncertainty spread rapidly, undermining morale not only among civilians but within military ranks. Japanese officers reported confusion, disbelief, and mounting frustration. Intelligence data, once reliable, now conflicted with visible outcomes on the ground. Command structures were strained. The Army and Navy often disagreed on deployment priorities, further complicating responses. Fuel shortages and limited operational aircraft prevented effective counterattacks. Even when fighters engaged, they were often too slow, too lightly armed, or too poorly trained to threaten the B-29s. The strategic calculation of homeland security that Japan could not be reached easily had been shattered in a single campaign. In the United States, the success of the first raids reinforced confidence in both the aircraft and the operational concept. B-29 crews returned from their missions with minimal losses, a stark contrast to earlier operations staged from China under Operation Matterhorn, where logistics and exposure to enemy attacks had severely limited effectiveness. The Marianas, with secure runways and robust supply networks, allowed sustained operations and set the precedent for the firebombing campaign that would follow in 1945. This first wave of attacks marked a decisive shift in the war. Japan's homeland was no longer insulated. Industrial centers, transportation networks, and urban populations were vulnerable. The strategic advantage had swung decisively to the United States, and Japanese commanders were forced into reactive positions, attempting to patch gaps rather than dictating the course of events. The psychological shock, the industrial devastation, and the stark realization of vulnerability foreshadowed the even greater destruction to come in 1945. Natural transition to Aftermath Section 2. While initial raids revealed the vulnerability of Japan, the situation deteriorated further as B-29 operations expanded. The scale, frequency, and destructiveness of subsequent attacks would push Japan towards ultimate collapse. By mid-1945, B-29 operations over Japan had become relentless. The initial raids from late 1944 had proven the feasibility of striking the homeland, but subsequent campaigns intensified both in frequency and devastation. Cities such as Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama were targeted in a systematic campaign designed to cripple industrial output and break civilian morale. Each mission exploited Japan's inability to intercept high-altitude, fast-moving bombers, further exposing critical weaknesses in radar coverage, pilot training, and aircraft availability. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th to 10th, 1945, marked the turning point in both scale and impact. Over 300 B-29s dropped incendiaries on densely populated districts, creating firestorms that consumed more than 16 square kilometers of the city. Casualty estimates exceed 100,000 dead, with hundreds of thousands injured or displaced. Factories, workshops, and transportation networks were destroyed, leaving Japan struggling to maintain essential wartime production. The physical and psychological shock reverberated across all levels of government and military command. Despite frantic attempts to organize defense, Japanese fighters could rarely reach the bombers, and anti-aircraft fire proved largely ineffective. Commanders faced the grim reality. The Pacific Ocean no longer provided a protective barrier, and the home islands were within easy reach of U.S. strategic bombers. Civilian morale plummeted, and confidence in military leadership faltered. Ordinary citizens, hearing the distant drone of B-29 engines night after night, experienced fear and despair in a way unprecedented in Japan's history. This systematic aerial campaign set the stage for the ultimate demonstration of the United States' strategic capability. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. By this time, Japanese cities had already suffered massive destruction from conventional bombing, further weakening infrastructure, morale, and the ability to continue organized resistance. The emperor, military leadership, and civilian population alike recognized the futility of continued conflict. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, formally ending the war in the Pacific. The consequences of the B-29 campaign were clear. Japan's industrial heart was shattered, civilian populations were traumatized, and the military command structure had been rendered reactive and powerless. For the United States, the campaign validated decades of technological development, industrial mobilization, and strategic planning. The crossing of the Pacific by B-29s, once unimaginable, had become routine, a testament to innovation, audacity, and the relentless execution of strategy. The human cost was staggering: hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced, and cities flattened. The psychological impact endured long after the final bombs fell, as survivors confronted the reality of their nation's vulnerability. The B-29 raids had redefined modern warfare, demonstrating that geography, once thought a shield, could be overcome by technology, planning, and determination. Natural transition to reflection/closure. As the war ended, historians and military analysts reflected on what the B-29 campaign had achieved, not just in destruction, but in how it reshaped the very understanding of strategic air power, deterrence, and the vulnerability of nations once considered untouchable. The crossing of the Pacific by the B-29 Superfortress was more than a tactical success. It was a turning point in the history of warfare. For decades, oceans and mountains have been assumed to be natural defenses, protective buffers that could shield a nation from distant enemies. Japan's experience in 1944 to 45 shattered that belief. Technology, logistics, and industrial might converge to overcome geography, proving that no distance was too great, no island too remote, when strategy and innovation were aligned. From the perspective of Japanese officers, the shock was profound. Years of confidence in coastal defenses, radar networks, and fighter doctrine collapsed in hours. Cities once considered safe now burned under bombs delivered with precision from thousands of kilometers away. The human dimension, fear, disbelief, and the overwhelming sense of vulnerability left an indelible mark on both leadership and civilian population. The war had entered a new paradigm, one in which survival depended not solely on numbers or courage, but on the ability to anticipate technological leaps and adapt to a scale of destruction previously unimaginable. For the American crews, the B-29 symbolized more than engineering prowess. It represented endurance, coordination, and the human capacity to operate at the extremes of risk and distance. Men flew for hours over empty ocean, relying on instruments, calculation, and the silent promise of victory. The campaign demonstrated the potential of strategic bombing to influence not only military targets but the morale and will of a nation, a lesson that would echo into the nuclear age. Ultimately, the B-29's unchallenged crossing of the Pacific was a reminder of the fragile balance between innovation and tradition, offense and defense. It forced a rethinking of military assumptions and highlighted the profound consequences of underestimating technological change. In the smoke and fire of Japan's cities, history recorded a truth both simple and unsettling. In modern warfare, no fortress is impregnable, no sky too vast, and no enemy truly out of reach. The shock of that moment, Japanese officers staring at maps and radar plots, realizing the impossible had occurred, resonates across time. It is a testament to the transformative power of technology, the courage of those who wielded it, and the profound vulnerability of those who did not. The crossing of the Pacific was not just a military maneuver. It was a turning point in human understanding of war itself.